The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. An Odyssey Through Jerusalem by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. 12. Zion. After we left the Armenian church, Selah had to leave us for a short time. He had to make an appointment with the Sanjak administration in another matter. For Holmes and me, this was a welcome opportunity for a private conversation about our findings, even though we no longer had any reason to not trust our Palestinian colleague. We decided to leave the narrow and densely populated streets of the old town and take a trip outside the walls. Holmes was heading forward in quick steps, and I had my troubles following him. Southwest of the old city, coincidentally in front of the Zion Gate, lies Mount Zion. Located on this hill are, among other things, two extremely important sanctuaries, namely one of the Christians and one of the Jews, the tomb of King David and the cenacle, and they are both even in the same building. The oldest layer of the building was probably from a synagogue, but over the centuries, after temporary destruction, an early Christian, a Byzantine, a Crusaders' church, and finally a Franciscan monastery were built. Our memories of the latter institution are pretty poor ever since our last case around Christmas that ended up with Twickenham Abbey being burned down. Anyway, the Ottomans had long since rededicated the holy site in question on Zion Mountain in favor of the Islam. Officially, there was now a mosque dedicated to the Prophet David. Nevertheless, the Jews were still allowed to worship the presumed tomb of David in the basement. The Christians could visit the vaulted hall in the upper floor, where Jesus Christ and his disciples are said to have taken the Last Supper. They would still have to pay an entrance fee, which we, as it turned out, did not have to pay for in the end. As we marched up the hill, it was of utmost concern to Holmes to teach me about the two holy sites. "My dear Watson," he began, "I hope you realize that the localization of these places is based on pure arbitrariness of a religious nature. The tomb of King David, if it would be preserved in any form, is hardly located on this hill, and the final sacrament can have taken place, if at all, almost anywhere. Not to mention the astonishing coincidence that Jesus and the apostles had their Last Supper directly on top of King David. To make a long story short, these are not historical sites." I was well aware of this fact, especially since it probably also applied to the Via Dolorosa. "While that may be the case," I replied, "this is not a matter of historical facts, but more a matter of principle." Holmes looked at me surprised and said, "Of principle? Well, it is the principle of lies, or at least ignorance." "That's right," I replied. "It is not a matter of knowledge, but faith. Even faith should not be based on questionable attributions, obvious lies and falsifications," Holmes continued, undeterred. "The Crusaders and the pilgrims accompanying them were so obsessed with Jerusalem that they not only massacred Muslims and Jews here, but also had an epiphany around every corner and found a sacred relic under every rock. You know that throughout Europe there are so many alleged splinters of wood from the cross of Christ distributed as relics that not only the two beams of the cross, but the entire Noah's Ark could be put together." I had to try not to laugh at my friend's successful, blasphemous humour, because I didn't want to do him that favour. But of course he was not entirely wrong. Therefore I decided to change the topic now. We had more important things to discuss anyway, but I could not keep myself from making a small potshot. "Don't call for my help," I said, "if you are deservedly rejected at the gates of heaven. For the time being we shall render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. What do you make of our latest findings, and what about Natalie's version of a non-given connection?" "I believe she's telling the truth," Holmes replied, expressing complete certainty. "You believe?" I asked in a somewhat mocking tone. "According to the criteria of scientific criminology, everything speaks for it," my friend quickly recovered. "In addition, one can assume that the Russians would not have spoken to us in the first place if they were behind the attacks. That would have been much easier. Rather, they obviously wanted to know what we knew." "And now they know we don't know anything," I added a little resignedly. "It doesn't look good for us." "Lo and behold," shouted Holmes with a smile, "suddenly you lack faith. After so many years at my side, you could easily have a little more confidence in my investigative skills. Admittedly, this is a somewhat more complex matter, but I have no doubt that we will unravel the threads." "From your lips to God's ears," I murmured, more to myself. But Holmes, of course, had heard my wish and replied, "God has nothing to do with it. Everything lies in our own hands, as always. Therefore, we want to recapitulate. They have deliberately set a wrong trail pointing to the Russians. What does that tell us?" "Well, that's obvious," I claimed. "It means that the perpetrators want to provoke a serious conflict between the Ottomans and the Russians." Holmes shook his head. "I don't necessarily think so. In the end, the trail would have gone nowhere one way or another, even without Natalie's intervention. In this respect, there is not enough substance for a political debate at government level. This had to be clear to the perpetrators as well. Therefore, it was only a strategic byproduct, a small diversionary maneuver to keep us a little busy, and now also the Okhrana. In addition, it is highly ridiculous to automatically suspect the Russians behind every transgression. This is more for tabloids and warmongers. No, the perpetrators have achieved only one thing. They have bought themselves some time. But for what purpose?" I had no answer, but the question was just rhetorical anyway, because Holmes immediately continued. "To prepare for the next attack, and this one could be much larger than the previous ones." "Not a very bright future," I said. "Indeed," Holmes said approvingly. "So far, the perpetrators have always been one step ahead of us. This means that we have to speed up our pace from now on." With these words, my friend actually began to walk even faster. I do not think his remark was quite that literal, but I immediately tried to keep up while ascending Mount Zion. Nevertheless, we would never arrive at the top. After about 10 minutes of silent ascent, Holmes suddenly stopped and whispered, "We are not alone, Watson." I no longer had the opportunity to dismiss this suspicion as paranoia, because it was confirmed to me in the next moment. All of a sudden, we found ourselves surrounded by 4 men who had literally appeared out of nowhere. They wore long black robes, a face veil connected to their turban only leaving the eyes to be seen. 2 of the men aimed guns at us. "This is probably a robbery," I whispered to Holmes. "Better we cooperate." But Holmes was already looking for a conversation. "Marhaba, gentlemen, or shalom. We are only 2 pilgrims on our way to the holy sites of Zion Mountain. What can we do for you?" One of the men that was holding a gun approached us and ordered, "Silence! We know exactly who you are. You come with us now. Back down. Go." But that's not very polite, it escaped me. The alleged leader of the raid squad built up menacingly in front of me and replied, "I sincerely ask for forgiveness, Dr. Watson. May I humbly ask you for the kindness to pay us the honor of your esteemed companion?" "Much better," I commented and turned back to follow the instructions. However, it didn't get far. After 2 steps downhill, I was hit in the back of my head with a rifle, fell to the ground, and immediately lost consciousness. When I opened my eyes, it was in vain. They had apparently blindfolded me and tied my hands behind my back. However, I was able to feel the bump that was caused by the blow. I was lying on a bumpy surface, probably on the back of a horse-drawn cart that was in motion. I straightened up my upper body and immediately heard a familiar voice. "Watson, are you conscious again?" "I think so," I replied. "Have you been blindfolded too?" There was no reaction, so I added, "It's not enough if you just nod." "Sorry," Holmes said. "I guess I was a bit absent-minded." "What happened?" I continued. "Have you also been beaten down?" "No," my friend replied. "That was just the punishment for your cheeky tongue. However, I was the real victim in the truest sense of the word. I was forced to carry you down the hill during your fainting. What an imposition!" "You have my full sympathy," I returned. "Do you know where we are? What's the situation?" "This is not a robbery, but a kidnapping," Holmes noted, "which further leads me to the reasonable assumption that this is the work of the perpetrators we are looking for. Apparently, they found us first. In any case, we were taken to a car and sat down at the bed. There we were blindfolded and shackled. Then the vehicle was set in motion. This is where we are now." "Have you been told where we will be taken?" I wanted to know. "No," Holmes replied. "The kidnappers are not too talkative. However, I can tell you that we are heading east. I can guess that much." "To the east," I repeated. "I don't want to go east. What's there?" "The Jordan Valley," Holmes explained. This allows for two possibilities. Either they want to baptize us in the river or send us across the Jordan River. I was immediately on alert. You think we will be executed? Well, my dear Watson, Holmes said, you are baptized already, aren't you? Cut it out, I admonished my friend. We are in grave danger. We will be shot. You probably wouldn't have thought, Holmes continued unabatedly, that in the Holy Land you could come so close to your Creator. Stop it, I growled. We need a plan to escape. What if we jump off the wagon? The speed should be low. And then, asked Holmes, then we walk blindly through the landscape? They would catch us again immediately. Honestly, that's not a particularly good plan, Watson. Do you have a better one? I replied ineffectually. Not yet, was the answer I didn't want to hear, but I'm working on it. You should hurry as much as possible, I demanded. I have no desire to end today and my life with a bullet in my head on the banks of the Jordan River. You won't, old friend, Holmes said, whispering secretively to immediately add, undoubtedly our corpses will not simply be left lying around, but thrown into the river. Thank you, Holmes, I whispered. That's extremely reassuring. And so the car continued undeterred on its way, at the end of which the certain and inevitable death would await us.